what we're discovering when we look at flourishing people who say they live deeply meaningful lives, that they are not stuck in their heads. They are not chasing self-esteem through a hero game, but they are rather turning outward.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. The conversation today really gets at the heart of our modern mental health crisis. Richard Beck, author of the new book, The Shape of Joy, takes us into how our cultural obsession with introspection and the pursuit of self-esteem has actually undermined our well-being. He traces this back to key philosophical and psychological figures like Descartes and Freud, who ushered in this inward turn. And he shows how this has led to things like excessive rumination, a fragile sense of self-worth tied to external achievements, and an inability to find true meaning and joy. But the real power of this conversation is in how Beck then points us towards an alternative, a path of transcendence, of finding our identity and security in something greater than ourselves. We take an outward turn to receiving from the transcendent one. He unpacks the psychological benefits of and practices like gratitude, awe, and spiritual connection. And he challenges us to move beyond just insight and self-analysis towards more embodied experiential ways of cultivating well-being. It's a rich discussion that really gets at the heart of our modern malaise and points toward a more joyful and grounded way of being. Definitely a conversation worth diving into. And after listening to this episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the episode with Andrew Root titled The Age of Secular Mysticisms, which dives into a lot of what we talk about here. Here is my conversation with Richard Beck. Richard, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really, really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's an honor to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to jump into The Shape of Joy, this new book. I think it's really special, and it's something that is needed in our day and age. So I'd just love to just jump in to it and
Sure.
just start to diagnose where we are as a culture. So maybe get into some Descartes and Freud, where we have gotten to, and what are we all about right now in our culture?
Yeah, sure. The central thesis of the book is right there in the title, that joy has a shape. I guess another way to think about it is mental health has a geometry. And what I mean by that is that scholars have pointed to, not just scholars, but psychologists as well, have noted how with the dawn of the modern era, that we have made a very introspective turn in regards to our understanding of ourself, and that we have turned inward. So a classic example here would just be the Freudian turn, where Freud argued that well-being is not achieved through making contact with a transcendent reality, but rather is to go deep into the psyche and the unconscious to sort through all of that. And that when that was done well, then one would, come back out of that inner journey with reorientation. Another one from a philosophical perspective is Rene Descartes. That might be a very obscure reference right here, but Descartes was known for the introspective turn when it came to epistemology, understanding just what truth is. And he did it by his classic turning inward and starting with his self-knowledge. I think, therefore I am. And that again is kind of an inward subjective turn that has culminated in our current kind of post-truth culture, where the self and the ego gets to define what reality is. So my interest is more on the Freudian turn because of the mental health focus, but philosophers would point to Descartes as the beginning of this kind of radical subjectivism, radical individualism, radical doubt, and that has led to kind of our current crisis about truth, which is a whole big rabbit hole right now in our culture.
Yeah, and that's a big rabbit hole. I mean, that's part of where deconstruction happens and trying to find your own truth, turning inward. One of the things I find kind of fascinating is that Luther describes sin as something that is curved inward, like sin is a curve inward into yourself. And it seems like now in our modern culture, as we're moving through Descartes and Freud, and it's the water that we swim in, it seems like we are turning inward to find ourselves, to find truth, and to find well-being and happiness, right? Is to turn inward. How are people trying to grasp health and well-being and truth inward? What's it look like, and why is it so elusive when we turn inward?
Yeah, so I would argue when we made this inward turn that mental health and the self became very self-referential, that we are seeking happiness through an instrument that is maybe not equipped to give us that sort of happiness. And so we are kind of very introspective and self-referential creatures. And so there's a couple symptoms of this that I walk through in the first part of the book. One is just data on mental wandering. The psychologists, when they have asked people and they have surveyed using like an app to just kind of text people and say, what are you thinking about right now? And they've discovered that almost half the time our minds are wandering. So the default state of the brain is just not present. So we're lost inside of ourselves, like wandering the gloomy corridors of our inner haunted house in one sense. But what's interesting about that mental wandering is it's also associated with greater dissatisfaction with life and unhappiness. So left inside ourselves, we aren't happy and we aren't restful. So that's one thing. I think we've also seen increasing evidence from the psychotherapeutic sciences that have suggested that excessively introspective therapies actually make people worse. Again, that Freudian assumption that I need to be thrust back in myself and revisit trauma hasn't really shown up in the mental health benefits that we had hoped. And thus you're seeing some of the best therapies of the world, like cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance-based therapy, which is more rooted in mindfulness, suggest that maybe stepping back from the self a little bit more objectively gives you a little bit more resilience and control instead of being excessively ruminative about one's life. The other thing I would say that we're also trying to, this self-referential attempt at mental health is effortful. I'm constantly trying to rehabilitate a negative self-talk in my head, and that effort is exhausting us. And so I spend some time in the book talking about how for a generation we have predicated mental health on the achievement of self-esteem, trying to achieve a positive view of oneself, and how fragile that is, but also how much work it takes to constantly be rehabilitating our self-regard. And also how we have invested our meaning in what Ernest Becker called like a hero project or a hero game, where we try to achieve some sort of prizes of significance. We all have different hero games that we play, but how those hero games make us vulnerable to failure, or games of comparison with others whose success threatens my own achievements. And so that creates a excessive preoccupation with how I'm doing in the world. So yeah, those are just some quick survey of some of the mental health landscape and the symptoms we see that is due to this introspection that we see.
I want to dive into some of those then. Sure. A little bit deeper. We're in a space in our culture now that we have more knowledge of mental health than we have ever before. And we could all talk the talk, right? We talk this game, and we don't all know, like, on a deep level like you do, of like all what's underneath a lot of this talk. But we do use a lot of the phrases to try and work ourselves into a place of health and well-being. Why is it, if we just continually ruminate on something on the inside, why do we get stuck there and not move outside of ourselves into more health? Why is more knowledge not enough right now?
This whole idea that faith and politics should not mix There's slivers of truth in that, but mostly non-truth in that, because it basically means that we as Christians should not allow our faith to influence how we view things, should not allow our faith to influence what we get involved in. And the fact of the matter is, our faith should permeate every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, I think one of the deep Freudian assumptions is that like insight would be curative. Right? That's the whole idea of psychoanalysis. I go into myself, and through the analysis, right? And analysis is a very intellectual kind of process, that if I achieve a degree of insight, then that insight would then automatically lead to mental well-being. And so achievement of insight is a psychotherapeutic goal. Figuring myself out is a simple way to say it. Why do I do what I do? But I think most of us have been aware that insight might be, a necessary part of the therapeutic journey, but it's not sufficient. Like you said, we are pretty knowledgeable about ourselves, especially if you are a pretty introspective person, you've gone through therapy. And if I sit you down and go like, why do you do what you do? Why are you so triggered? How we can narrate that actually at a pretty professional level. Like I can tell you exactly what my problems are. I can tell you. So I have all that insight, but I still find myself unable to control or direct myself. And so the lights are maybe on the inside, but I still lack certain kind of capacities for behavioral change. And there's actually this is where the cognitive behavioral psychologist would step in and say that that insight might not even be sufficient. I mean, necessary. Like getting to the root of why we are the way we are might not even be the point. The question is, if you want to change, let's focus on that. That'd be a very behavioral take. And interestingly, those behavioral problem-solving takes tend to be the most empirically validated psychotherapies as well. So anyway, I think that's one of the issues there is what is the role of insight in mental health? And I think we've been given that therapeutic, the Freudian story that insight, if I just could figure myself out, then I change. And I think we're realizing finally, like, that's not necessarily true. You can have accurate insight and still struggle with yourself.
I mean, the lens in which I view the world a lot is I try to view the lens through Jesus. I really like Jesus a lot. Jesus is pretty amazing.
Yes, amen.
But one of the things, it feels like as a rabbi, as somebody, he actually brought people into some behavioral change through experiential learning, through more like places where you're going to go out and do it. We're going to debrief the actual experience of what you have had to figure out, what you were doing in the past actually maybe wasn't working well. And there's a new way that I'm actually pointing you to that actually helps you and gives you some health and well-being. And it expands what I'm doing here too. It's just an interesting thing, I think, for us in the West, as we've moved into a more of this talk model of like, we're going to talk ourselves into something without the experiential. If we move into this space of counselors, psychologists, of people trying to get therapy and working through some of their depression, anxiety, or whatever mental health issues that they're working through, has there been any type of apprenticeship or experience that people are starting to walk through that is not just a lay on the couch session, which can be helpful, but I'm just curious if there's anything else that's happening right now that may look a little bit more experiential than before.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think my initial answer is, not that I've seen in the mental health industry. I think the mental health industry is still pretty much governed by what we'd call the medical model. So that the client has a diagnosis. The diagnosis is characterized by symptoms. They go to therapy, and that the therapy is meant to alleviate those symptoms. And that model of going to see a therapist in a clinic to alleviate symptoms is still very medical in its approach. But what you're pointing to is this great tradition, not just in Christianity, but across world religions, about the art of living well. And psychology hasn't really approached it much that way. Those experiential things about the art of living, the virtue traditions, where we point to exemplars and we follow them, or we apprentice beside people. So you're going to see more of those kinds of what we would call in a Christian tradition like a spiritual formation practice, where I'm being formed more in the faith traditions. Now, to be clear, spiritual direction might be a part of that, but even spiritual direction still has a kind of one-on-one. I go in for my spiritual direction, and it has a kind of quasi-therapeutic milieu. So I'm not literally like living alongside my spiritual director. And so I haven't seen a lot that has that, and I do think that's maybe the one thing that as Christians and churches look at the missing piece in following Jesus is that whole following piece. Where is that occurring in my church or in my life or even in my spiritual direction? So I would say I don't see a lot of that being done, except for informal spaces where we walk alongside each other in close community, in mentoring relationships and coaching relationships and things like that. But it's a missing piece.
I think we'll pin that and we'll come back to that. But on the other side of the talk, ruminating within ourselves, you put self-esteem and this superhero complex that we have of trying to get our self-worth and our happiness through what we achieve and our achievements. And this is, I don't know, it's very much a Western construct of like, I am what I do. Like, this is why we say, like, hey, if I meet you somewhere, Richard, what do you do? That's our first question, right? It's like, hey, inflate your ego and say, talk about all the great things that you've done. How does this superhero complex play out in our lives?
So I've taken the idea of the superhero complex is really from a podcast about people in Seattle that were dressing up like literal superheroes, trying to stop crime on the streets of Seattle. And that was the title of the podcast. Like, why would people dress up like Batman and Robin and try to stop crime? I just downloaded all the episodes. I'm so excited to listen to those. It's such a good podcast. But the point is, that seems ludicrous to us, obviously, that people would do such a thing. But obviously, people were doing this because it gave their life kind of a heroic narrative. I'm making a difference. I am a superhero in some sense. And I take that idea and go back to a psychologist named Ernest Beck, who argues that we all have, in some degree or another, a superhero complex. We all have our own unique versions of trying to achieve significance. And so if it's not dressing up like Batman and stopping crime downtown, for me, it's being a professor and an author. For you, a podcaster, or a lot of us, like you'd mentioned, it's our jobs. It's the meritocracy, staving off the status anxieties of being successful. Our families of origins have hero narratives, like your families tell you what a successful life looks like. And so we all have a self-selected kind of ecosystem of meaning and significance that we're all trying to achieve a durable sense of worth. But again, the problem with that is, like I said, is that is a very effortful game. But because it's a game, it means that your value is something you're competing for. Your value is something you're straining for, so it's effortful. So it's competitive, it's rivalrous in games of comparison. Sometimes we win those games of comparison when we have shame, pride, or superiority. But sometimes we're losing those games, so it's envy, jealousy, insecurity, inferiority. So it's rivalrous, it's effortful, but it's also like precarious. It's something that you can lose. And so just the fact that you're trying to achieve self-esteem means that's a game you can lose, which means your value is always in play. And that's where I think we see a lot of the fragility, the loss of kind of a psychological resiliency, because my worth is something I can lose. And thus I stay on a kind of a hamster wheel of striving to kind of keep that game afloat.
Yeah, and we try to keep up and we could never do enough. That will actually play into this place of scarcity, right? That we aren't enough. Even though we may have a few external things on the outside to go, oh, in this moment, you feel like you're enough. You've been validated right now. But now what's next right after that, right? How is scarcity tearing us up in the inside, that we're not enough?
Yeah, Brene Brown calls it like the never enough problem. And the point being is, if you stand still, as you were describing, if you stand still, somebody's advancing out in front of me. And so to be content, to be stand still, it feels like settling. And that's where that comparison comes in. I see somebody advancing beyond me in some sort of metric. So feeling not enough in myself, a neurotic scarcity in myself is the fuel that drives that hero game. And so one of the turns I make in the book is kind of this new interest in psychological circles on the psychological value of humility, which seems strange because a lot of us that were raised in conservative religious backgrounds would hear. You'd be surprised to hear that humility is the secret to moving to psychological resiliency, because humility is perceived as thinking less of yourself or denigrating yourself or knocking yourself down. But instead, what psychologists are discovering, that humility is two things, right? Well, it's many things, but mainly it's rooted in a secure identity. So to your point, you've overcome a neurotic scarcity, right? So it's rooted in a stable identity. Once you then have that stable identity, then you can become self-forgetful. Because at that point, my achievements cannot be diminished by other people. I feel secure in them. So that's the paradox of humility. It's rooted in a deep ego strength and an ego security. And that ego security gives you the capacity to be other-oriented towards, in a non-competitive kind of way, because nothing's at stake for me in this interaction. And so you kind of see that, biblically, you see that when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Right at the beginning of that narrative, it says Jesus, knew where he came from and knew where he was going. So he's doing that act of service, not out of shame, not out of, he's not being diminished or humiliated in any way. No, to the disciples, it looks like he's humiliating himself. Like they want him to step out of that space of service. They are still dealing with kind of the shame issues. But Jesus is shame resilient because, back to the point of scarcity, because he's not operating out of scarcity. He's operating out of a sense of being enough, right? He knows where his identity is going, and thus gives him this kind of radical capacity to be indifferent to social stigma and shaming.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing that humility can do that. That is so right view. It's rooted in our identity. And oftentimes, I think these two parallels that you're talking about is where we often try to find our identity by turning inward, of seeking out the truth of who we are. And that truth is then elusive. It's just my truth, right? And it's just an elusive truth that today I may, be, my identity is this thing, and tomorrow it may be something else, or it's found in my achievements and our worth and my external circumstances. And that's a quick little question I have, that a lot of times I think that people think that achievement and success and actually doing the work is a little bit of turning away from yourself, of moving towards something else. But how is that achievement place and that hero complex, how is that still a place of turning inward, even though you are trying to achieve self-worth and esteem from outside of yourself and the external circumstances that you have?
Again, because the game of significance you're playing is a self-selected one. These are metrics that you selected for yourself. Now, obviously, you probably imbibe them or absorb them from the culture. Again, family of origin, the larger culture you're a part of, and we're just deeply social creatures, and so that's what shame is. Shame is fundamentally a social emotion. I know shame has been stigmatized a great deal in a lot of mental health literature, but shame is just a social concern about my reputation and how people look at me, and we need that, right? Like we need a kind of an internal monitor of that. But because we're such socially conditioned creatures, those metrics of success tend to be adopted by myself. I perform those for other people. But the trouble with that, Carl Rogers, famous pioneering psychologist, talked about what he described as like conditions of worth, where we seek the positive regard of other people, and so we often perform for those conditions of worth to get that positive like regard. But that then twists the self, because then we begin trying to satisfy a spouse or satisfy our family or satisfy our workplaces or some other person gazing at us. So to your point, in one sense, it's maybe less an example of an inward turn there, but still getting lost in the gaze of other people. And given that all of those other people are caught up in their own hero games, we suddenly find ourselves, not only do I find a lack of security in myself, I can't find it in the gaze of other people as well, because as we know, as we trust our worth to other people, that is a very precarious and dangerous kind of thing. And I think this is one of the reasons why you see among adolescents, that gaze of other people is now a screen. It's the social media gaze. It's the likes. It's the attention, and how we've seen with Jonathan Haidt's work, the anxious generation, how living in the gaze of other people has also radically destabilized the mental health of a generation. So it's not the scarcity of myself is multiplied in the scarcity of others, and so we're just kind of lost. We can't find any firm ground.
So it feels to me like it's a house of mirrors, right?
Yes, exactly. I think that's the perfect metaphor.
Yeah. But Jesus was rooted in his identity. He knew whose he was and where he came from, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times we try to find ourselves through like, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? He's actually getting his identity from, whose he was. And he found it right there at his baptism, right? Yeah. The heavens opened up. The Father says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It's right there. That's his identity. He knows it. He's rooted. How do we then secure our identity so that we can then be humble, to quiet our ego, and to live a place of rootedness and groundedness?
Yeah, so that's the last half of the book, back to the geometry metaphor. So if we've just described a little bit of how the inward turn, the introspective, self-referential self destabilizes our mental health, and if things like mindfulness and humility, cognitive behavioral therapy, stepping back from yourself is just getting a little distance, then the final thing is what you're describing, is what I would call like that outward turn, the self-transcendence. And that's the interesting story here, is how over the last 20 years, the rise of what's called positive psychology, this is the scientific study of like happiness and well-being and human flourishing. So that's huge right now in psychology, that what we're discovering when we look at flourishing people who say they live deeply meaningful lives, that they are not stuck in their heads. They are not chasing self-esteem through a hero game, but they are rather turning outward, and so one of those places, like you're describing, is what psychologists have described as mattering. Mattering, some people would call it existential significance, even cosmic significance. Some psychologists have described it as like unconditional positive regard rather than conditional positive regard. But the idea there is that Brené Brown would call it that that what gives us shame resiliency is feeling worthy of love and belonging. So that's mattering, right? Just that you matter no matter what. And this is just a constituent fact of your existence. So your question about like, how do you do that? Well, I think religious people, spiritual people have a move they can make that when their hero game crashes and burns, and the facts of life are staring them in the face, that they can spiritually go to a place where their value is held safe and transcends current circumstances, and they can find rest in that space. If you don't have a religious move you can make, or a spiritual move, then the only move you can make is the one we've been describing. Like, you got to resuscitate the game. You got to conjure up a new life story, or you sink. And so how do you rest in that identity? Well, I don't know if it's a therapeutic move. I think it's a religious move. I think it's a spiritual move. And the disciplines of the faith tradition are going to help us do that. So I would point to things like not just mindfulness, but contemplative prayer, to practices of receiving grace anew. Those practices, those spiritual practices, pull me out of myself and locate my identity in that baptismal location that you described, where it's something I receive. It's not something I earn. It's something I receive, and therefore it becomes a place of rest and not effort.
Yeah. So it comes from outside of ourselves. So, things like Alcoholics Anonymous have, talked about the higher power. That's been really helpful for millions of people that have said it's really not just about me. It's about somebody else or something else, or this higher power. And there are different ways to design what is the divine, what is this transcendent being, thing, creator, whatever you want to call, that's outside of ourselves. What does it look like to then receive that from the outside, from outside of ourselves, instead of conjuring it up from the inside of ourselves?
Well, yeah, that is tricky, right? Because in many ways we might, be replacing one set of work for another set of work there. I do think that we do need to be intentional about practicing self-transcendence. And I do think there's ways of doing that, simple practices. And you're right, like, I want to be generous with whatever spirituality a person is coming into this conversation with. But for example, like, one of the things we know is that practices of gratitude, just as a simple technique of being thankful or saying thanks, is highly predictive of like mental health. So, and gratitude is something I can practice. Yeah, I have to be intentional about it, but it's not really work to sit there and just say thank you in a gratitude journal at the end of the day. Like, studies have shown that people who just do simple gratitude journals are mentally healthier and physically healthier and socially healthier. But what's interesting about gratitude is that you're just saying thank you to what? Like, for life, for the day. And that even if you just have a vague sense of what you're saying thank you to, if that is God or it's a higher power, the Dutch have a word called somethingism. It translates as somethingism, which I like, which is like, I don't know what that is out there I'm saying thank you to, but it's something. It's the ground of being. And I think most people get that. I understand there might be some hardcore materialists and atheists that just can't even conceive of that. But I think most people get what I'm describing here, transcendence in some way. That when I sit there and just say thank you, I'm pulled out of my hero game and I'm just being grateful. And then I have these mental health benefits. So the mind tends to operate with this flip geometry. As I look outward and I say thank you. Here's another example. One of the hottest topics right now in psychology is awe. Wonder and awe has been shown to have all these great mental health benefits. And awe is fundamentally an encounter with a reality bigger than my own. It's other than my own, right? I'm not in my own head. Back to your metaphor, the hall of mirrors. I'm not in a self-referential hall of mirrors. I am rather out of my head, making contact with reality other than my own. So it's not subjective anymore. It's more objective. And it's bigger than my reality. And when I encounter that, the awe is related with what psychologists call the small self. And small here is probably not the best word. A better word might be interconnected self. When I connect with the reality other and bigger than my own, I feel part of a whole. I feel at one. And that's a humble posture, because I'm not the whole world and the whole world's not riding on me. But I'm also connected in like ethical kinds of ways with the world. Like, because we're connected, what I do affects you, and it affects the trees, it affects everything. And so again, think that through. Connection with a reality bigger than other than my own. And again, religious people will know what they, know what they're aiming at there, is associated with better mental health and more pro-social ethical behavior. It makes you healthier and more compassionate. So again, so gratitude and awe are just two examples of practices, because awe can be a practice too. I can take a walk in nature. I can expose myself to art. Moral beauty is one of the biggest predictors of awe. I can expose myself to heroes, moral heroes that inspire me. And I can be alert to just attending to those acts of kindness in the world that trigger that feeling in me. So that's not necessarily work, gratitude and all, but I was arguing like more practices of attention that we can pay to the world that flip the ego inside out.
Just humor me for a moment. I'm really fascinated with Acts 2 and the early church, when the church first started. And so these practices that you're actually talking about are present there in the early church. And one of the things I think we skip over a lot, the signs and wonders being done. It's awe and wonder that this early church is experiencing this awe, but then it's also then connecting all of them into a greater story, a story that's bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
And especially for a population that was subjugated under Roman rule, was subjugated under the Maccabean rule before that, and just kept on being subjugated, that it was a rumination of, how are we going to get out of this ourselves? Are we going to rise up and be revolutionaries? Like, what's going to happen to get us out of this? And then the actual flow of sharing everything that they have with one another, and then connecting to a bigger story, and then things start to multiply and grow out of that, and it spreads into a place where there is more health and well-being and happiness, because they are in a different story than they were just a week before, of what it looks like. I just find that fascinating. And I could see all of these things in the early church.
It all connects. Yeah. So it's interesting how psychology is just kind of catching up with some of those things that the faith traditions have always pointed to, and we see exemplified in those early Christian communities. Because that's what was like. Why were those communities so attractive to the poor and the marginalized? And it was because they found in those spaces, again, a story bigger than their own, a mattering, a cosmic significance, a wonder and awe that made them feel connected with each other in the koinonia of the sharing of that kingdom. And so, those aren't just, that's not just woo-woo. That had like material manifestations in the radical sharing and interdependency and mutuality of those groups. And so it's the inside is joyful and the outside is loving and compassionate. And sometimes I think that's why a purely materialistic view of social change and activism can be just trapped in another kind of hero game, where you will see in like radically activistic communities that just have a very materialistic Marxist view of social change, that they miss the awe and the wonder and the joy and the compassion. They're trying to force change like from the exterior onto the brute, raw, mechanism of the world. And those communities tend to burn out. They're not very joyful. They struggle a lot, deal with burnout themselves. So there is something about that inner spiritual engine that, like almost like a nuclear reaction that creates then from the inside out the changed world that you see demonstrated in Acts 2.
Yeah. In my day job, I lead a missions organization, and this is for all of our missionaries, we have strategic coaches that would help on the ministry side. Then we have pastoral care people that help, with that side. A lot of the times our pastoral care people say we got to pull them off. They got to deal with their trauma and their wounds and stay there. And, the strategic people said, hey, they're doing good work. Keep them on. What is then a balance for all of us, any of us, when we are wounded, when we are hurt, when we actually do need some work and some therapy, but we do know that a lot of our worth and joy is found from the outside, from beyond us. So what is that work and balance to continue to move beyond us and be connected to a bigger story, and to do the work that we need to do to be healthy and whole as well?
Yeah. Because that's the insidiousness of the superhero complex, isn't it? That even my good work becomes another performative metric. I remember my pastor friends in the first months of COVID, how their mental health kind of struggled because they were deprived over that season from all of those metrics of feedback and performance. They didn't realize how connected their self-image had been to getting in front of a group of people and getting complimented and moving a crowd and feeling that self-reinforcement. And we need all of that, to be clear. Like, we need feedback loops. Like, we want to have a dopamine hit that gives us pleasure. That those reward systems draw us deeper into work and provide that motivation. But then it putrefies when it becomes performative, and I'm getting my identity through this nonprofit or this ministry. So even though it was begun with very altruistic reasons, it can still be very performative. And like, I'm not, that's something you know very
100%.
well. Yeah.
I know that very well.
So, I mean, all I would say is one of the things I like to just tell people is, like, go as far as your joy takes you. Like, let joy be like the check engine light, in your spiritual car. And then if you're starting to do this for, a buzz of success, or you start feeling like you're just grinding away, and that check engine light kicks back on, and then maybe I need to stop and do some work and recalibrate. That might be therapy, but that might be just a more intentional practice that you do daily to kind of revisit your source of joy. I just, like, for example, like I'm dealing with that right now, just to be confessional. Like I have a new book out, and I am every day I get up, I am trying to fight the battle within myself to be concerned about how it's doing right now. Because reviews are appearing on Amazon, so I am overly invested in how that's doing. I want to look at sales, and then people make it worse by asking me, like, how's the book doing? I'm like, well, don't ask me that, because now I'm back in my superhero complex. like I was doing fine until you brought it up, but now that you mention it, now I'm thinking about it. So I think all of us have to just realize how insidious those games are, and my game as a new author is different from somebody else's game. And so I do think there just needs to be daily practices where I'm being liturgies almost, where I am trying to step away from that internal anxiety, that internal scarcity. If my book doesn't sell well, then I'm not enough. And to say, hey, regardless of how that performs, take joy in the work, enjoy conversations like this one that the book sparks. Be grateful, be grateful for that, and realize that ultimately, I got to stand in the Jordan River with Jesus today, and hear who I am, not perform for it.
That's so good. So what does that look like for you to get outside of yourself to receive that? What are your practices that help you?
Well, I mean, I'm a church person, so I see just worship itself as a practice of renunciation and reception. When I stand in worship, I renounce my superhero complex and receive anew. So I like to tell my students that worship is literally re-experiencing Jesus's baptism. That's what's supposed to happen in worship. You stand there and receive again who you are. So I'm pretty committed to worship as a weekly practice of church going, and I have daily prayer practices where I am engaging in this kind of work that I was describing. Like, so this morning I was praying that through. And then, and to me, my other practices just is watchfulness. I really think faith is often a perceptual issue, and so it's a kind of a mindfulness practice, but it's not just being aware of my surroundings, but it's the Ignatian practice of looking for those consolations where God shows up in my day. So those little moments of gratitude and awe that I notice. So I do try to be very wakeful, like on my bike ride to work today, be very wakeful just about the beauty of the sunset. All of that just pulls me out of myself, back into that small self experience. So those are some: commitment to worship, daily prayer, and practices of wakefulness for gratitude and awe throughout the day.
So, Richard, this book, The Shape of Joy, is absolutely fantastic. I think it dovetails very, very well. Last year, my favorite book that I read was Andrew Root's The Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms, which actually it's very similar in a lot of ways, where we're looking for something beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
Or transcendence. That's, memoirists are new mystics and we're talking about the hero complex. And so I love just walking through this and going real deep with that in your book, especially in the psychology of it. But what would your hope for your readers be if they would pick up your book and read The Shape of Joy? What would you hope that they would get from it, and how would they move in the world because of it?
In many ways, I think my book's like a little bit of a sneaky Trojan horse. I'm using the science of psychology to follow that thread, to have a conversation about God. And so I hook people on the front end with our mental health crisis, and I'm pretty psych forward in the book. But by the end of it, I get pretty clear about if it's true that mental well-being is rooted in transcendence, then we're going to have a conversation about that transcendence. Is that a trick of your mind, right? Is transcendence, like is gratitude just another life hack? Is it just another tip, for self-actualization? Or are you really in a relationship with something greater than yourself? And so to me, that's my hope for the book, is to kind of walk through let the science bring you to a conversation about spirituality. And so that's my hope.
Well, it does it, and it does it well. So I want a lot of people to go out and get it and pass it out. Just buy boxes of it and pass it out to your friends. I'm sure that does a lot for your hero complex right now.
Yeah, so now you made me I'm back in my head again, Yeah. And that's my metric. My metric as an author is just when somebody says, hey, your book hit me at the right time of my life and it made a big difference. Like, to me, that's it. Those stories of that the alchemy of that intersection, right book, right time. We all have stories like that. So that's all I want for the book.
And I'm sure it's going to hit a lot of people that way. I have a couple quick questions I'd like to ask. At the end, one, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I would say get out of your head. I was a really rationalistic person, and that rationalistic analysis kind of led me into a lot of doubt and skepticism for a season. And so I wish I would have told myself to stop thinking and just take a walk.
That's such good advice, though. That's such good advice. Go take a walk. That's good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I have been reading David Bentley Hart's, I think it's All Things Are God's. And man, that is a crazy deep dive. Like, you got to be interested in philosophy of the mind. But I finished it. He writes it as like a Socratic dialogue, and I found it really fascinating. I find his work really interesting. What I enjoyed in it was because he's pushing against the scientific materialism of the age, and so I thought it was a really helpful a read. I don't know if I'd recommend it widely. You got to be pretty nerdy to read that book, but I took a great enjoyment from that. And I guess what I'm watching right now, my wife and I are watching The Penguin. We're following the Penguin series on HBO, so enjoying being in that universe a little bit. Yeah.
Nice. One of the podcasts that I follow, they said the latest Penguin episode was one of the best episodes of TV all year. That was phenomenal. So I haven't checked it out yet, but
yeah, I'm a Steeler fan, and so like the Steelers were on last night, so I didn't watch the Penguin last night. So we're gonna pick that up tonight.
There you go. Russell Wilson, Justin Fields. I don't know what they're doing, but
it's complicated. We'll see how we do. Yeah, it's complicated.
That's good. Well, I'm from the Seattle area, so I was a big Russell Wilson fan.
Oh yeah.
And he was with the Seahawks for a long time. So I'm glad he got a shot yesterday, and he did well. He played well.
They won. so we're along for the ride. So yeah.
We'll see. So how can people go out and get The Shape of Joy? And where else would you like to point people to?
Yeah, so The Shape of Joy is on wherever you buy books. It came out last week, and so it's online wherever you get your books. So you can look at that. And I still have my original blog, but most people now follow me on Substack. So Monday through Friday, I write about just what I'm thinking about, life of faith. And so Richard Beck, Experimental Theology on Substack. You can find me, subscribe for free. Content's all free, so you can keep up with me there.
Excellent. And that's probably one of your practices. Get all your thoughts out.
Yeah, get out. Take a walk.
And that's good. And I think, everybody check out Richard's Substack and go get The Shape of Joy. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for sitting down and walking us through, like, ruminating inside of ourselves. And what does this therapeutic age look like for us in this hero complex, and trying to get self-esteem and significance out of what we do and accomplish in our external circumstances, and then figuring out how to be rooted in our identity, be humble, and what humility actually looks like, to have some wonder and some awe and transcendence, so that we could actually move towards something outside of ourselves, and that we could figure out what is the shape of joy, and that we could be people of joy. So thank you. It was a fantastic conversation.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.